Well, good evening, everybody. It's time for another episode of Dukakis Center Live, a special episode this evening. One of three events that we have scheduled this current week on elections worldwide. The year half the world voted is the title of the sequence of events. And I'm pleased this evening to be with two fellow citizens of the United States, two experts in U.S. foreign policy. We're going to approach the subject from the point of view of the potential impact on the making of United States foreign policy. We're keen to try to make sense of and do justice to the fact that nearly 2 billion people around the world have voted in an election this year, 2024. You can add an additional 5 million Hellenes who voted in one of two parliamentary elections last summer, the summer of 2023. And we're thinking also that we've just recently concluded a general election in the United States that has seen Donald Trump elected president, due to be inaugurated in mid-January 2025. We have a few elections forthcoming. The surprises never end. We're likely to have early elections in Germany, a flash election in France, owing to the fact that it appears as if the current government is about to collapse. There's a vote of no confidence due to take place in the French National Assembly. We have the second round of presidential election in Romania coming soon. So the numbers are a little bit tentative, but they're still mind-boggling if you consider that it's nearly half the population of the world who have been called upon to vote in an election this year. I have two special guests who are joining me, but you'll allow me to say very briefly that the Dukakis Center, inaugurated in 1999 by Governor Dukakis himself, has as its mandate and mission to seek to inspire young people to take an active interest in public affairs. And when we say young people, we're talking about the Hellenes who attend classes at ACT, the American College of Thessaloniki, the international student body we host here, students from throughout Southeast Europe and farther afield. And of course, very healthy numbers of study abroad students from colleges and universities throughout the United States. This year, we had close to 350 study abroad students on campus. They're just finishing their final exams and preparing to return home for the holiday season. When I thought about this program, I look back to a course I was attempted to design, perhaps even as long ago as 20 years ago, a course in political analysis. And I asked myself, what are the things that you need to have? What information would you have to have in order to offer a serious analysis that a curious fellow citizen might consume and learn something from? More recently, I was inspired reading the French press about the phenomenon of the hung parliament in France, the snap election that was called by President Macron after his party did poorly in the European elections earlier this year. And I thought, well, there are a group of people, at least in the French media, who are quite gifted in political analysis. It dawned on me that we have a number of acquaintances here at the Dukakis Center who spent time in the Foreign Service, who've done reporting of one sort or another, prepared some form of analysis to be shared with fellow diplomats back in the United States. And wouldn't it be rather interesting to compare the sorts of analysis we do in think tanks, in the mainstream media, in university classrooms, with the sorts of analysis and viewpoints that American diplomats might have? Thinking also that given the global range of interests that we have in U.S. foreign policy, that we should be taking interest in elections and outcomes of elections if we're American diplomats. So here we are. We'll be talking a little bit about the outcome of the election in the United States, how our former diplomats think about that, how their viewpoints may differ from viewpoints of other analysts. And then we'll turn our gaze a little bit to elections that have taken place throughout the United States. Allow me now then to introduce our speakers this evening. First, I'd like to introduce John Koenig, a personage that our friends in Greece know quite well, his having spent time as the Consul General of Thessaloniki, I think right around the turn of the millennium, if I'm correct, John. So welcome back to Thessaloniki. John has participated in several events we've done here at the Dukakis Center, in person and online. And we have a relative newcomer, second off, would be Andrew Miller, who's just recently retired from the State Department. He has expertise in Middle Eastern affairs, Near Eastern affairs, I think is what you call it. But he also has been a practitioner in the field of democratization, and we're going to turn to him for his expertise in this particular area. So welcome to both of you. Welcome to Dukakis Center Live, and thank you for joining me this evening.
It's good to be here.
So let's start with the first question, general comments, and I know you probably have some, and I'm thinking, Andrew, you're probably now free to speak freely, no longer having the constraints of being a public servant. But I ask John, what his general observations are with respect to elections in the United States and elections worldwide.
Well, I mean, as you pointed out, David, this was a year when a lot of elections occurred, and there were parts of the media in particular, but also academia and other places that saw this coincidence of elections as being particularly significant. And I would say, I don't want to exaggerate that, but it is useful with this new data, I guess, that we have to sort of take the pulse of the vibe or the mood of the world. And overall, I would say what seems to be demonstrated by most of these elections is a serious questioning of certain long-held beliefs about the order of society. Challenges to neoliberalism, for example, seems to be quite prevalent, and quite a bit of anti-establishment sentiment in the West in particular. India, of course, when India votes, you already get like a quarter of the world voting or something like that. So India's election was clearly the largest in scale of all of these elections. But, and there you had a flawed election that renewed the mandate of Narendra Modi, who was a very powerful leader and seems to enjoy a great deal of legitimacy as the leader of India, despite his manipulation of the political system. So that makes you wonder a little bit about how important the quality of elections, which was for so long an important issue for Americans, remains. And the same thing is kind of true of American elections. The quality of elections, even though it was very much debated during the election, with Republicans asserting that the election might very well be unfair if Donald Trump didn't win as president, the quality of elections does seem not to be an issue that is embraced by the public to the degree that we would like. And in fact, there's a great focus on outcomes. And this, I think, is a disappointment for anybody who believes strongly in institutions and the rule of law. But nonetheless, it seems to be prevalent. I'll say a word about, maybe I should give Andrew a chance to speak, but I would like to say a word about elections in my own state, which were very much out of keeping with the national trend. So may I do that?
Please do, John, please.
Okay. You know, I live in Washington State, which is a little bit more important than I think many people in Europe realize. It's not a small state. It's the 11th largest state. It has the 8th largest GDP. Its GDP is almost 3 times the size of that of Greece, for example. But it is a very distinctive state up in the northwest corner of the United States. And one of the things that really marks it as distinctive in this particular election cycle is that we swung further blue. Now, you can measure that in different ways. The the electoral margin in favor of Kamala Harris was not as large as the one in favor of Joe Biden in 2020. So in that sense, perhaps we didn't achieve that. But all statewide offices are now held by Republicans. The majorities of the Democratic, or by Democrats, I mean
Democrats, right?
The Democrats have large majorities in the House and of Representatives and the Senate in the state. We sort of reconfirmed a carbon cap and trade scheme that was extremely controversial and opposed by big business. It's a very unusual state. And that suggests to me, given that Americans in Washington read the same media for the most part as Americans who live in other states, that perhaps we are in a rather peculiar position where institutions in Washington state are more highly regarded than they are nationwide. And why would that be? That's a big question. I think it just deserves study, more study at the level of states and localities into the results of this 2024 election would really be beneficial in trying to understand the meaning of these elections. There's a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking of blaming people for making electoral mistakes. I don't think that's particularly useful, but a more academic approach, honestly, that looks more at the data, tries to assess the campaigns from a more objective point of view rather than a sort of take no prisoners, I want to be in the lead point of view, might be really useful.
So a serious analysis as might have been conducted in previous generations.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
Okay, Andrew, would you like to chime in? Where do you vote, if I may ask?
So I vote in Virginia, but I grew up in Pennsylvania. It's quite the juxtaposition, because growing up in the 1980s and 1990s, if you had told me that my home state would vote Republican 2 out of the last 3 elections, while the state of Virginia would vote Democrat 3 consecutive elections, I would have looked at you like you had 2 heads. But that is now the reality. And it shows that change is possible, and it is the defining feature of elections, the uncertainty. If you know who's going to win, well, little value in having the elections, and it doesn't give people an opportunity, a belief that their voice matters, that they are helping to determine who is going to govern and rule them. And I think the mere ubiquity of elections is further testament to the fact that it's still accepted, elections are still accepted as the best barometer for evaluating the preferences and views of people, and as the fairest way of determining how governance should work. Now, of course, the fairness of each of those individual elections is going to vary, and a number of elections are anything but free and fair. But the fact that you go through the exercise of having elections in the first place means something important. And that suggests to me that there is a durability in democracy, in the practice of democratic governance, that has not diminished despite the turmoil of the last decade. I think the counterpoint to that, as Ambassador Koenig mentioned, is this fact that people are increasingly evaluating their democracies not on the basis of the quality of the process, but on the outcomes, which is troubling, because if a system is only as good as its results in any given year, you could argue that a system other than democracy could produce better results. Those of us who believe in democracy and who have practiced democracy for many years believe that it's both the best way and the fairest way to determine governance, but also that in the long term, it tends to correlate with better outcomes. In the short term, there are always going to be fluctuations. And it's not just in parts of the world where democracy is less well entrenched. In the United States, there's clearly a growing, I wouldn't say skepticism, but a growing resistance to institutions, as noted, to include the electoral system in and of itself, with a number of people saying that if my candidate doesn't win, then the elections by definition are not legitimate, or even worse, that the type of candidate I would support couldn't possibly make it onto the general ballot because the system is biased and fundamentally flawed. And that is a concern. But I think when you look across elections comparatively, across countries, you do see how particular systems matter, how voting systems matter. You know, one of the features of the United States that doesn't make it unique, but puts it in a smaller category of countries, is that you have this thing called the Electoral College that determines presidential elections, and then you have first past the post elections for both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And that tends to favor a two-party system. And I think if you look at it objectively, most people would say a country of 300 million people, it's going to be difficult to reflect the diversity of views in a country that large with just two parties. In other countries, especially in Europe, where you have parliamentary representation, there's a greater degree of chaos, perhaps. There's a greater degree of contingency in terms of coalition building, but I think it tends to produce a greater confidence that you can find some party that represents most of your views, if not all of your views. Whereas in the United States, it really is an either or, and it is zero sum unless you're going to vote for the Reform Party or the Greens, which just have no chance of actually registering. And it does raise questions about the impact of electoral systems on the long-term success of democracy. And I think they do have a major impact. And we've certainly seen that in Europe historically, where there seems to be a sweet spot between first past the post elections and proportional representation with very low thresholds that tend to produce unwieldy coalitions. If you get proportional representation with a sufficiently high electoral threshold, that ensures a diversity of representation. It ensures a variety of parties without producing chaos. Those systems seem to have survived more shocks that others have. Now, the United States is somewhat rare in that we fetishize our Constitution. It's a document that written over 200 years ago, and we many Americans regard it in the same way that Christians would regard the Bible, or Jews would regard the Torah, or so on and so forth. That's obviously not the normal approach. It's viewed as a living document that was created at a time under specific circumstances, and it should evolve with the time and circumstances. That viewpoint exists in the United States, but it's still a minority, and the system itself is designed to protect itself. So it makes those course corrections hard to achieve. And I think France in particular is going to be very interesting to see how it develops, because we saw a first round of voting that seemed to be pushing in one direction. People actively organized and mobilized to prevent that outcome. Now it looks like we're headed back to elections. And the United States, there isn't that degree of flexibility. There isn't that degree of adaptation in the moment to try to moderate outcomes. So you often have winner-take-all systems where now we have a Republican president, a Republican Senate, and a Republican House of Representatives. And that is going to make it more likely that significant changes take place than if you saw a few seats change parties in either the Senate or the House. You would have some type of check built in. So all of this provides a lot of grist for understanding the complexities of the electoral process. I'll just close by seconding what the ambassador said, which is globally there does seem to be this defining feature of a growing disconnect between governing institutions and publics, and a sense that systems are no longer delivering for people in the way that they used to. And that is very much a potential threat to democracy. It's a potential threat to security, to the international economic system, to the welfare of individuals. And I know for the United States, and as someone who is, as someone who was a Democratic political appointee, we're very much thinking about what it takes, what it requires to win the support of the public. How do we break through that barrier and reestablish trust that has clearly begun to diminish?
Yes, I read something, and it probably was in the New York Times, which is a newspaper that you both probably read. And just one of the comments struck me. It was said that voters do not think like political analysts. So we have a sophisticated, nuanced understanding of the nature of political systems, the variations, the variables, but that seems not to be commonplace anymore among citizenry in large numbers of countries, I suspect. So I'm just rather curious to know, as you think about it, is there an appetite anywhere for analysis of this sort? Or do we have to dumb down our presentation? Or do we have to find different ways of reaching out to citizens who are a little bit curious about how the system functions, if in fact they're out there? I don't know, John, because you've been teaching lately, what happens when you interact with your students? Do you find that there's an appetite for discourse on the level that we've had thus far in our discussion tonight?
Yes, I really do. I think there is a desire, I think, to have a more meaningful discussion about the future of our country, to be perfectly honest. And the coverage of elections tends, I think, to not properly serve that interest. You know, I would fault the New York Times perhaps more than any other major outlet, certainly except broadcast outlets, for really fetishizing the horse race aspect of elections, and actually leading most coverage of the elections with proprietary material like their own sort of focus groups among swing voters. This is a very strange way to understand the stakes in an election. In fact, I think it's one that really increases cynicism about elections. When you essentially go into the election season telling most Americans that their vote doesn't count, that you're really going to focus on, 20,000 people in 5 counties in Pennsylvania, you really do reinforce the distance between the public and the electoral system. And I think that's why election coverage in the mainstream media is becoming increasingly irrelevant. My students are very keen to take a more critical approach to basically everything, because this is a generation that feels disserved by the system, I would say, generally speaking. So they're very open to alternative points of view, and of course they're very open to alternative sources of information. They really do obtain a lot of their information from social media, and therefore, of course, who they cultivate in their social media feed is relevant. I worry, however, that this has led the establishment and the parties to think that they need to sort of micro-market messages to small slices of the electorate, but I think that's a huge mistake. And that happens more on the left than on the right, in my view. The right message is kind of consistently anti-establishment. It is, strangely, that's not what conservative parties are supposed to be about. It's not really a conservative movement, but it has a rather consolidated, I think, media environment in which dragging down institutions is the main objective. On the left, there's a more, I think, deliberate effort to deliver appealing messages based on a kind of marketing scheme to customers. And that, I think, has worn out its welcome. I think people feel it's highly cynical, manipulative, and just doesn't reach them where they live. So my students, in my class, we are much more analytical. We question assumptions, which now seem to be more or less sacrosanct. It was interesting to hear Andrew, you can call me John, by the way, to hear Andrew describe how we regard our Constitution as somehow, I guess, belonging in the Trump Bible. But the Constitution is not, quite noticeably, in the Trump Bible. And we can't keep, I think we are very seriously hamstrung in adapting to the new situation we confront in America and the world if we continue to fetishize our Constitution, which has so many anti-majoritarian and flaws, and is also extremely susceptible, as we've seen in the last few years through several Supreme Court decisions, to what seems to be partisan manipulation by the majority on the court.
I'm kind of curious because you spent time in other parts of the world. John is a Europeanist by and large. Would would you have a receptive audience to the kind of analysis you just offered us in Egypt or in Gaza, where you've done some work with the State Department, or other parts of this region in the world? Are we a little bit blasé potentially in Western Europe, in the United States, Canada? We tend to think of ourselves as rather superior in the way we understand and talk about politics. But I'm just kind of curious here. We're thinking again a little bit about the market and appetite for the sorts of analysis we're doing right now, and then we'll consider potentially other ways of reaching out and understanding what other people are thinking and how we might communicate better with them. Andrew, you spent time, I think, in Egypt. Is that not correct?
Yes, yes. During the Arab uprisings, when there were free and fair elections going on, which was fascinating to see them take place for the first time in the country's modern history, and to be there and to be in an environment where people who had been denied the opportunity to register their voices for so long finally had an opportunity. And there was no shortage of interest. There was no shortage of enthusiasm, but the existing structures, both formal and informal, were not present to help provide the information regarding the parties, regarding the candidates, regarding the major issues that were facing the country. So there wasn't a degree of the environment had not been prepared for it because it hadn't been expected. I do think one of the differences, and this is something that needs to be overcome, and I think in the United States we can also do a better job, but as John was describing, it's how you engage with the media. It's not just what media you're looking at, it's are you doing it with a critical lens? Do you have the tools to analyze it, to evaluate the sources, potential bias, to consider implications, connections, particularly in countries in the Middle East, in Egypt, where the educational system tends to be more rote. It's a question of just recitating facts versus critical thinking versus writing analysis. I think that ill serves the public because they're not provided with this. It's not that they're incapable of doing this; they just haven't been provided with the analytical software, as it were, to be able to evaluate the information that does come in their direction. So even when information was being provided, even as we saw new newspapers emerge, some of which were very good, some of which conformed to the highest journalistic standards, you had large parts of the public that simply were not in a position to consume it in as sophisticated a way as befits public debates of such significance. And there is no substitute for education. There is no substitute for providing that that framework. And as with any skill, I think the earlier you start, the better it is. It's the same with languages. You're going to pick it up more easily if you start when you're 7 or 8 than if you start when you're 27 or 28. And the same is true of critical thinking. If that's something that's inculcated from the earliest stages of your educational experience, you refine and hone those skills. And to a great extent, that can help to compensate for some of the flaws in the media environment that John referenced. And I think one of the things that comes to mind is just the conflict or the tension between democracy and between capitalism in that sense, where...
Okay. Yeah, continue. Whoops, I think we've lost John. He seems to have lost his connection here. Thinking about his experience in Egypt, I'm just tempted to say that's what we do here at ACT, the American College of Thessaloniki. We teach people how to, or we try to encourage them to think for themselves critically, which is not a feature of national election. Maybe you're nodding your head knowingly, John, but that is an issue that we overcome. But we also sound like imperialists sometimes, saying our system of education is a little bit better. But I concur very much with what you've just observed, Andrew, about the education system. I want to turn the discussion in a slightly different direction. I have here that I'm looking. I don't know how actually to present it, but it's a poll, and it shows what the authors of the poll, what's called an organization called Data for Progress, call news attentiveness. And they asked the people who were polled, some 13,000 American citizens, how often they consume the news, the mainstream media. And the most interesting data point here is that more than 50% of the pollees who claim to have voted for Donald Trump do not consume the media at all. So there's no interest whatsoever in the sorts of media that you and I would consult, partly because that's how we grew up, reading the local newspaper and then graduating to the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal or something like this. And I saw a pretty decent analysis on Axios AM done by the journalist Mike Allen, and he coined the phrase shards of glass as a way of imagining what the current media environment is in the United States, if not elsewhere in the world. So we have, and John, this echoes something that you just said, we have people who are trying to reach customers, or in this case, voters, looking for what have been called shortcuts. How can we bypass the mediators, and how can we reach out directly to a voter who might be sympathetic or find sympathetic the thing that I have to say? I think the Donald Trumps of the world have done this exceedingly well, and other parties and other candidates are seeking to catch up a little bit. But what about this metaphor of the shards of glass? Is that an adequate representation of the current state of the media environment today?
Well, in my view, David, I think it may be. I mean, I'm kind of conflicted in my answer to this, because I think to follow this to its conclusion is to go further down the wrong path. I think the message is essentially the problem. And by simply tailoring the same message to the appetites of different consumers, and this is really approached very much using the tools that come from modeling business sort of customers. Mm-hmm. This is not likely to help us, I think. It may help in individual elections to win. I don't doubt that. It may be that a more effective scheme of delivering the message to meet the appetites of customers works, because it works in the commercial environment, it works on social media. There are many, many tools available to achieve that. That may be called shortcuts, but I think our bigger problem is the legitimacy of our system, which seems to be deteriorating. And this does not sound to me like the way to address that. When you say 50% of Trump voters don't pay any attention to the media, I think that takes us back to a problem that Andrew has already raised. We need to educate our children, basically, to be better citizens. And this has been sadly neglected for decades. It's not as though we got into this box overnight with the election of Trump in 2016. So how do we distinguish between citizens and consumers? I think it's a kind of a social responsibility that is kind of most realized in our educational system. I think it's critical thinking. I think we have so many models internationally that are more successful than our own. If we would just borrow them and not allow people to bring forward kind of silly political or constitutional arguments why they cannot be applied in the United States, I think we would be better off. Look at the Baltic states, for example. They've been much threatened by cyber attacks and media messaging from Russia, and they've made a deliberate effort to develop critical thinking about media consumption, including social media consumption, and they've succeeded. They actually have much more resilient societies than we have to withstand these kinds of incursions of sort of disinformation. we can't get past square one because there are so many corporate interests that do not want us to go in this direction.
Okay.
That's my view.
Okay, and that echoes, I think, something that Andrew was saying earlier, if I'm not mistaken, that there's an economic dimension to this that we overlook. Is that not correct, Andrew?
Yes, that's absolutely right. The economics and profit are not necessarily going to correlate with the public good. Capitalism is very good at delivering products most efficiently, but sometimes what we're trying to achieve as a people, as a community, as a country is not just efficiency, it's comprehensiveness of coverage. It's ensuring that all citizens are able to exercise their rights. They're all are able to enjoy a decent life. Capitalism isn't necessarily the best model for that. That's not to renounce capitalism by any stretch of the imagination, but by applying those business models, by applying those commercial techniques that make sense and often function quite well in the marketplace when you're talking about widgets to public affairs, to determining leadership, it can have a distorting impact on outcomes that often produces suboptimal situations for the American voter, and that's clearly the case. That's clearly the case in the last several cycles. And one of the significant developments to me in the 2024 election was when groups associated with the Trump campaign were running campaign ads touting Vice President Harris's support for Israel in markets that were primarily Arab American. So
in Michigan, let's say.
In Michigan, yeah, exactly. And it shows that, not only that it's limiting to go after to pursue these, to pursue particular demographic groups in that way, but it also creates a vulnerability. It creates a perverse incentive to manipulate and distort those individuals as opposed to appealing to the public, writ large. And I do think that the corporate candidate is passé, and if the Democratic Party or any party continues in that direction, they're going to continue to suffer losses. People want, if not authenticity, they want a sense of responsiveness. They want a sense that people are speaking to them. And for all of his warts, in a certain way, President Trump is authentically inauthentic. It's a bit of an oxymoron, but it's true that what you see is what you get. That's what he is. And it's not honest in many cases. It's not true, but people know that, and people understand what they're dealing with, and that provides them with a degree of discomfort. But just in my experience, working at the State Department during my last tenure, I was dealing with one of the issues, foreign policy issues of the greatest domestic political salience with Gaza and Israel. And speaking with students, speaking with professors, speaking with people in communities, the level of disengagement that they felt from the government was revealing to me. And I took from that the conclusion that we were failing, at least in that regard. We were not communicating, and communication needs to be two-way. It's not just speaking at the public, it's hearing the public. And that doesn't mean you simply do what the public says in all instances or what the majority view is, but you need to foster an environment where their input is being considered and they feel they're being heard. People can live with outcomes at times that divert from their preferences if they believe that their viewpoints, their concerns, their interests are at least being taken into account. And right now, for too many Americans, and not just Americans, I think for too many democratic citizens throughout the world, they have a feeling that their views have been discounted, that they have been alienated from their political system.
I'm just curious. I'm asking you to imagine that you're Finnish diplomats now, and you're reporting on the election in the United States just passed. Are you going to be saying the same things, or is there something else that you would add to the analysis you've offered us so far this evening? Are you going to dissect the issues in the sort of the problem besetting the individual political parties, why this candidate was successful, why that candidate was not successful? Is there something different about the way you're reporting the outcome of election as compared to what you're saying with me this evening?
Yeah, David, I would say yes, absolutely. You know, as a diplomat representing a country abroad, your responsibility is indeed to understand the political system in which you're working, and that would mean you might actually share many of the views that Andrew and I and you have mentioned today. But your job is to advance and protect the interests of your own country. So you would examine this election through a different lens. And I think we kind of know what European diplomats are reporting to their home countries about this election: tremendous uncertainty about the future, and probably recommendations on the most effective tactical means to get the best outcomes from a new Trump administration that are possible, given all of the uncertainties that exist. And that would be how you would evaluate this. So I've interacted with quite a few Baltic diplomats since I've been at the University of Washington, and they only really want to talk about one thing. It's Russia. I don't think their entire existence is Russia. I don't think their understanding of the United States is based simply on American policy vis-a-vis Russia or Ukraine, but that is all that they're paid to care about. When
okay. Interesting. So let's move on then to the foreign policy implications. I can imagine two ways of asking this question, but I'll ask the second one first. I mean, how important is it for the United States that close to 2 billion people have voted in elections this year? And we're thinking about the 5 million Greeks, as I said, who voted in 2023. And in Greece, we had two separate parliamentary elections. And then we had local and municipal elections. My wife, Fotini, incidentally, was a candidate. She didn't win, but it was an interesting experience. And we had a record number of ACT alumni who ran for public office as well. And of course, we had the European elections here. Now, if you're thinking, let's say I'm following the trajectory of the foreign policy of the Biden administration, you would say that this is a positive development that so many countries around the world are able to have elections and somehow heed the will of their populace. But is this indeed how we should be thinking about it as students of U.S. foreign policy? I don't know, John, let's go to you again.
Yeah, I don't know what to make of this in terms of U.S. interest in foreign policy. I would call it more like the harmonic convergence or a solar eclipse. It's a coincidence of things. It teaches you some interesting things about this universe or the global political scene. But I think outcomes are in critical states are still clearly what matters. And I'm particularly focused on the outcome in France and in Germany, because really any effort to sort of augment the sort of capacity and autonomy of Europe as a geostrategic actor hinges on a solid outcome in those elections that sort of enables those countries to reestablish some kind of role as engines for the European Union. So that's my focus as a Europeanist. Otherwise, I think I would focus mainly on something that Andrew said. It's encouraging that countries around the world still regard the conduct of elections as a critical element in legitimacy. It's not always been the case that that's true. It's not as much the case that that is true any longer as it was, let's say, 20 years ago, but it's still something that's valuable and we need to encourage. Otherwise, just I'm more interested in outcomes, I have to say. I'm much more focused on interests and outcomes than I am on the conduct of elections as a factor in American foreign policy.
Okay, Andrew, because up until recently you have somehow been representing the Biden foreign policy environment. Are we in agreement with John here that it's great that there have been all these elections, but let's see that we get the right outcomes?
Yeah, I think it the elections themselves do matter, but it would be disingenuous to suggest that outcomes are irrelevant, that certain outcomes aren't better for U.S. interests than for others. And in particular, in the countries that John cites, where France goes, where Germany goes, we'll see what happens in the UK with the Labour government already on its
faltering. Yes,
faltering. Those are going to be incredibly impactful, and that is going to consume most of the time of U.S. diplomats and U.S. foreign policy experts. It's less going to be the process of elections and more what are the outcomes and what do the outcomes mean. And then just as foreign diplomats are doing with President Trump, it's trying to understand how do you influence this potentially new government that's coming in? Who are the key players? Who are the key institutions? How can you shape their thinking in a way that's consistent with U.S. interests? That's very, very important. I think you have to add another variable to make the democratic question most relevant, and that is not just the number of elections or the number of people engaging in elections. It is the quality and the environment of elections. And while like John, I'm uncomfortable with anti-majoritarian features, there need to be certain protections for civil liberties, for civil rights. And there are many countries in which elections take place where those rights aren't assured. We mentioned India, where you still have democratic elections, you still have people voting, and they're largely fair, but you have a lot of significant segments of the Indian public whose rights are not being respected and who are suffering as a result. And I think democracy as a system is still the best, but unless it's coupled with a commitment to civil rights, to human rights and basic protections, constitutional protections, it's going to be limited. So I think a purely procedural approach to democracy that views it just as casting a ballot is incomplete. Of course, it's important. If there aren't ballots being cast, then it's not a democracy, and something is lost in the process. But you also need to assure that minority rights are going to be protected, that those who have differing views are still going to have the opportunity to express them, and that is not guaranteed in all of these contexts and in all of these places. So that's something that I would be looking at, and I think from the Biden administration's perspective, they would view the number of people participating in elections as important, as something that is consistent with their world vision. But ultimately, there is this too often unstated interest also in the nature of those elections and the broader political environment after election day. Because if you just reduce the democratic process to a single day, then 364 days of the year, you actually don't have a democratic government. You have a government that's democratically elected, but is acting in a way that may flout democratic norms and sensibilities. So, for better or worse, though, as a diplomat, you have to account for the outcomes, and even for diplomats, including U.S. diplomats who have an interest in the health of democracy, we're going to be pleased that these elections are taking place, but we're not going to ignore the fact that candidate A wins versus candidate B, and candidate A has this position, whereas candidate B has another position which is more favorable to the United States or more favorable to our global priorities.
If Donald Trump were in office now, had he won in 2020, or had he been successful in overturning the results of the election, would we be thinking about the fact that 2 billion people around the world have voted a little bit differently? That's the first question. And I wonder now, going forth, when you have an administration which is, well, ambivalent about democracy, are they going to be thinking a little bit differently in the way they interact with other countries? They're not going to be, in fact, Donald Trump may prefer to do business with a country like Russia because they don't have elections. They don't have to fuss with all that. I mean, it's a simplistic question. It's not really fair to ask you, gentlemen, here in the space of 2 or 3 minutes to answer that. But to pursue your thought further, Andrew, what do you think? Would it have made a difference if Donald Trump were in office in 2024?
I certainly do think it would have made a difference had Donald Trump been president the last 4 years. And it would have made a difference both for the United States domestically, but also for U.S. foreign policy globally. And what we saw from the Trump administration from the outset is there were a number of people who had previously served in government and brought a degree of competence. But for every person that met that criteria, there were 10 others who had no prior experience, and they didn't know what they were doing. And whether you agreed with what they wanted to do or you didn't agree with what they wanted to do, they probably couldn't do it because they didn't understand how the executive branch operated. They didn't understand how the executive branch works with the legislative branch, with the judicial branch. By the end of Trump's first term, I think there was greater familiarity, and I expect that this new, Trump administration, depending on who winds up in the most senior positions, may be more capable of advancing some of the policy initiatives that it sought to between 2017 and 2021, but was unable to do so either because of legal challenges or simply because they weren't sophisticated enough in using the machinery of state. I do think we would have, certainly in the context of the election results being overturned in 2020, that would have fundamentally changed the 2024 elections. There's a question as to whether there would have been 2024 elections and what rules they would operate under, because it wouldn't just be the fact that the results were overturned, but that this illegitimate government would have been able to operate for that 4-year period. And I think many Americans in those circumstances would be looking at other countries and saying, that doesn't sound so bad. Maybe we should have an opportunity to express ourselves. It's very easy to take for granted what we already have. Americans excel at that. Once it's gone, then we have more of an appreciation for how significant it is. But we would also have seen with Trump, and I think we will see with Trump once he returns to office, the domestic characters or characteristics of any given foreign government are going to be less important to how he operates. Yes, he has a preference for dealing with authoritarian figures. There is a mind meld. There is a degree of envy that they have these authorities. But ultimately, he's focused on trying to make something happen. Whether we think that thing is good or not is irrelevant. He wants to be seen doing something. And if he's sitting across the table from someone who can make something happen with him, it doesn't matter whether they're a small d Democrat or whether they're an authoritarian leader, he's going to be willing to deal with them. And that it may also have an impact in ways that are not anticipated by Trump's own supporters. In particular, if you look at Iran, for instance, where you're going to have a number of advisors who either privately or publicly are seeking the overthrow of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and I certainly have no brief to carry for them, but I'm generally don't support regime change by force. Donald Trump's concern with Iran has nothing to do with the character of its regime. It's its actions. And if he thinks he can do a deal with the Islamic Republic, he's going to do it, regardless of what his advisors think. And most of his supporters are going to follow what he says, because there is this cult dimension to his support. He could say tomorrow that the sky is purple, and I think a fair number of his supporters would concur with that assessment. That's the attraction it has. So in one way, it's problematic because he doesn't demonstrate enough respect, enough consideration for democratic norms. On the other hand, there is value in the pragmatism that he is looking at where he can have an impact. And if he sees someone or some country that is prepared to move forward with something he believes is in hopefully U.S. interest and not just his interest, he's going to do it in a way that it might be hard for a classic Democratic or Republican administration that just won't deal with certain countries in the same way because of the nature of their political system.
Okay. John, I see you chuckling and probably in agreement. So do you want to chime in just a bit?
Sure. I mean, I agree with everything that Andrew said on that. And I would just amplify a little bit on the possible sort of halo effect of Donald Trump's presence in American politics in terms of foreign policy. I think we had backed ourselves into a virtually impossible sort of moralistic or sort of principled position over the last decade, which we were not really fighting our way out of. And I would say, if I have a criticism of the Biden administration on foreign policy, it's that it did not adequately address this. It's silly to believe that it could pick up at the end of the Obama administration, sort of import a few elements of Trump's foreign policy and carry on as though nothing had happened in the world. And it was fundamentally wrong. So what I see as this halo effect is not a lot of the things that Trump necessarily wants to do. I worry a lot about Trump's administration. I think it's going to have a strong impulses to use force in ways that even the traditional American foreign policy was reluctant to do, and perhaps even more irresponsibly. I don't know. However, it has sort of exploded the notion of a foreign policy consensus, which is a very good thing. We do need to have a debate about what the national interest is. And it's strange that in the last 4 years, it is Republicans mainly who have been demanding this. It's sad. It is not as though there is a prevailing consensus on the left. This is simply not true. There's just a kind of a circling of the wagons on the left around the Biden administration, which was perceived to be threatened domestically and internationally by its opponents. And this, I think, was a shame. So I'm hoping that some ideas that are brought forward by the right will continue to be good, like pushing earlier for a negotiated settlement of the Ukraine war. But I'm hoping that we'll also start to hear from prominent figures on the left, besides Bernie Sanders and maybe one or two others, advocating for a change in our approach and a more serious scrutiny of what our interests are and what realistic outcomes might be given the power sort of scenarios in which we are operating. I really feel as though this would be a powerful incentive to get more people engaged on foreign policy and kind of diminish the tremendous cynicism, I think, that exists about how the United States wields its foreign policy on the left. I mean, you can say that the center left is maybe 100% pro-Biden, but there's a large spectrum on the left that really doesn't believe in what we're doing and doesn't have any leaders. So I'm hoping that will change.
So maybe a few years in the wilderness, and then some voices will emerge. You mentioned previously, I think, Andrew, something about the way we fetishize the American Constitution. And thinking ahead to the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, I'm reading a book by a historian named Pauline Meyer called American Scripture. And in a way, she has done a kind of analysis, not dissimilar to what you've been saying about the Constitution. How suddenly did it become this written in stone sort of document that describes or defines who we are, and why aren't we a little bit more flexible in challenging it, understanding its place in American life? I think the Constitution of the United States is such a unique document in its political force, because where else in the world you have people talking every day about the Constitution? It's just quite extraordinary. But here we are, we're coming close to the end of our time together, and I want to just throw an idea out. We've heard it in the 3 sessions, one way or another, that we've conducted this week. The year half the world voted. Is American democracy in danger? And as a corollary to that, probably, I think it was in Foreign Policy, an article I read, asked the question, can democracy prevail globally without a democratic United States? So either, if you want to take on one or both of those questions. Maybe I'll turn to you, Andrew. Is American democracy in danger? Is it in its death throes, as so many scholars imagine was the case after the 2016 election of Donald Trump?
I wouldn't say that American democracy is in its death throes, but there are threats to American democracy. And I think part of helping to sustain and to continue to develop American democracy is to not take it for granted and recognize that even countries that have practiced democratic governance for decades can suddenly find themselves backsliding in ways that are deeply alarming and were widely discounted at the time that they were occurring. So vigilance is one of the best responses to the threats that do exist to American democracy. But for me, the biggest threat is it's less a question of any given candidate or president. And yes, Donald Trump is unique in many respects, and I don't think we can put any other American president in his category just in terms of even Nixon. There was at least a base respect for some degree of the law applying to him, even though he got perilously close at times to rejecting that. For me, it's much, democracy survives because of the people, and democracy dies because of the people. And the fact that so many Americans feel disaffected, that so many Americans voted for Donald Trump or voted for a third party or didn't vote at all because they thought that the system simply was not responsive, it was not relevant to addressing the problems in their lives, to their hopes and dreams, to me is the greatest threat to the continuation of the American democratic experiment. And we need to find ways to rectify that. And it has to be done at all levels, top down and bottom up. It includes the U.S. government itself, the executive branch, Congress, individual members. It includes the political parties, other national level political organizations, and it includes Americans in their home communities, engaging, mobilizing, trying to encourage other, their neighbors, their community members to participate in the process, to recognize that there's nothing incompatible with saying that democracy remains the best form of government, but our current system has flaws that need to be addressed. Okay. I think the absolutist position that it's either irredeemably flawed or everything is perfect, it is not going to accurately describe the situation as it exists. So I do think the level of threat to American democracy is certainly the greatest it has been in my lifetime. I mean, it would be hard to compare to the Civil War, for instance, where it wasn't so much that democracy in the North was threatened, but that was a fundamental challenge to the Republican democratic governance. But certainly in my lifetime, it represents the greatest threat. But it's by no means a foregone conclusion that it's going to turn out one way or another. And as I said before, that is part of the spirit of democratic elections. It is uncertainty. It's everyone agreeing we don't know who's going to win. We determine who wins. And getting people to engage on that basis and to demonstrate that the government is responding to them. And I think that also applies to foreign policy within the United States, where, for many decades, the U.S. foreign policy, the U.S. political establishment largely relied on kind of elite lobbying to conduct American foreign policy, where it was largely key members on key committees, and as long as they were supportive, then you could rely on a sufficient budget for the State Department. You could rely on support for certain policies. That's not the case any longer. If you don't take the case to the American people themselves, if you don't have American citizens writing emails, calling their members of Congress, saying this is what we support, it makes the entire foreign policy edifice, both as an institution, but also as a collection of foreign policies, more tenuous. So we need to have that engagement from the public, not just in the elections themselves, but in all areas of public discourse. And that has rarely really slid off. And those who are in positions of authority, those who have been in positions of authority, have a special responsibility to try to contribute to bridging that gap. And I do think it is bridgeable. It's going to require effort. It won't happen automatically.
Okay, great. Excellent. John, do you want to finish off?
Sure. Thanks, David. First of all, I agree 100% with everything that Andrew just said. And to pick up where he left off, I think a generational change will probably do us good in this respect, because our efforts, it's perhaps unfair to describe the U.S. government over the last 8 years as a gerontocracy, but you'd have to explain to me why that's unfair. Their inability to sort of utilize the means of communication that are most relied upon by young people has perhaps been in large measure because they don't know how to deliver messages in that way. I would like to take up the second part of your question, though. Can democracy survive in the world without American democracy? And my answer would be probably yes. I mean, we don't know. It's highly hypothetical. I don't think, as Andrew also said, I don't think we're on the verge of becoming a non-democratic country. I think we're being tested. We face challenges. However, I would look at it somewhat differently. Have we helped democracy over the last 20 years in our own policy? And regrettably, my answer would be no. We have actually probably set democracy back because one of the foundations of democracy is the rule of law. And we have very seriously chipped away at the rule of law in international affairs over the last 20 years, in almost tragic ways. I mean, the most glaring example, I suppose, is the way that we've treated the International Criminal Court, because it's very much on people's minds due to the indictments against Gallant and Netanyahu. We participated in the drafting of the Rome Statute. We were quite enthusiastic until it reached the Washington sort of political class, and then it was rejected. But for a long time, we had a kind of ambivalent attitude about the International Criminal Court, and our view is still ambivalent, but we actually often seem to want to destroy it. And whenever it kind of crosses a red line in our own domestic politics, for the most part, we decide we need to destroy this court. And we've kind of taken that approach to a lot of the international organizations that we built in the post-World War II era, and then that we renewed in the 1990s. We have taken a jackhammer, basically, to the system which would underpin, ideally, a resurgence of democracy worldwide. And I don't know how we get out of that. I'm afraid the next 4 years are going to be extremely grim in this regard, where you might actually see sanctioning again of representatives of the International Criminal Court. You might see a lot of ridiculous discussion about pulling out of the United Nations, or at least most of the specialized agencies. It's really a disservice that we've done to global democracy by following this path. And I hope that at some point before too long, perhaps through more public engagement, perhaps through more public appreciation of just how critical these institutions are as an underpinning for legitimizing American engagement as the kind of 800-pound gorilla in international affairs, we might wake up and realize that we have a big stake in international law. I don't think we've been giving that message at all over the last 2 decades.
Well, we hate to end on a grim note, but I have a further obligation. One of your colleagues there at the American Center for Progress, Andrew, our mutual friend and acquaintance, Alan Makovsky, has informed me that he's attending the funeral of I think a luminary in American foreign policy, Morton Abramovich, who passed away yesterday. We take an interest in his career because he served as U.S. ambassador to Turkey. And he had outspoken ideas about what was happening in Bosnia in the 1990s. And one of these movers and shakers in the Foreign Service who actually got things done, I think, from within, more or less. So I feel the obligation just to express our condolences to any one of you or your colleagues who feel that passing deeply as our friend Alan does. I want to remind our listeners that we've been with John Koenig, the former ambassador to Cyprus, among many other things, and Andrew Miller, who's just recently I think, resigned or retired from the State Department. I'm not sure what the correct word would be, but
So
you find yourself...
I stepped down from my position. The Washington Post said I resigned in protest, which was not true, although I disagreed with the policy. I left to spend time with a 3.5-year-old daughter I hadn't seen in 2 years, but I guess that illustrates our point about the media and its unreliability.
So at any rate, you find yourself at the American Center for Progress. Is that correct? Center for American Progress?
Center for American Progress, that's
excellent.
Correct.
Okay, in Washington, D.C. John has joined us from the other Washington State. We've been celebrating this year our 25th anniversary season of public service initiatives at the Dukakis Center. You can see the banner just behind me, something I'm very proud to have finally put together. We've been talking a little bit about the outcomes and the conduct of elections worldwide with a variety of people who have an interest in that sort of question. This is our final event and our final webcast for 2024. Next spring, we'll host a scholar from American University who's done some research into the types of personalities who helped found schools like Anatolia College or the American University, I think, of Beirut, in the latter years of the Ottoman Empire. And that is certainly of interest to us here. They're American expats like me who somehow, in a manner of speaking, represent the interests of the United States in an informal fashion, thinking that if we can spread the wealth of what experience we have as educators with our counterparts here in countries like Greece, then that will stand the United States in good stead, that we're actually doing something to further the interest of the United States overseas. And I think of myself kind of as an informal diplomat. I don't know, John, whether you'd concur or whether I'm going a bit over the top here. But that's what we've tried to do at the Dukakis Center, really to help define what public service is and can be in a country like Greece, where the political culture is quite a bit different. We want not to be imperialists, but somehow to learn what we can from our local counterparts and see if we can't contribute something on our own. So there we have it. We are at the studio of Anik Nefsi's Web TV. It's an opportunity also for me to thank my friend and colleague, Pentelis Savidis, the Dean of Politics Journalists in Northern Greece, who has had this long-running program on a Greek national TV called Anik Nefsi's. It was just a force of nature when you encounter him and understand all his various interests. Pendeli, if you're listening, thank you very much for hosting our Dukakis Center Live episodes this year, and we look forward to seeing what we can do next year. At the control panel this evening has been one of the senior interns I have at the Dukakis Center, Agapi Farab. And so to the extent that the image looked pretty good and the sound sounded pretty good, we have her to thank. Before we take our leave, we wish everyone happy holidays, and I say Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, and we look forward to seeing everyone after the turn of 2025. Good night then.